Hello and welcome to Newscentre. I'm Parikshit Luthra. Wealth inequality in India is widening with each passing year. This according to a new report released by Oxfam India. The report comes on a day when the world's most richest and powerful gathered for the World Economic Forum in Davos. The report shows that the richest 1% control more than 40% of the country's total wealth. Meanwhile, the bottom 50% control only a mere 3% of the wealth. The report says that taxing India's 10 richest persons can raise enough money to bring all the out-of-school children back to school. It can also cover the entire cost of tribal healthcare for 5 years. Taxing the unrealized gains of India's richest billionaire from 2017 to 2021 can generate enough wealth to employ 50 lakh primary school teachers a year. To reduce this disparity, Oxfam India is calling upon the Finance Ministry to introduce policy measures to tax the rich. It has also recommended increasing the budget allocation for education and health sectors. To discuss this further, joining us now is Amitabh Behar, CEO at Oxfam India. Thank you very much for joining us, Amitabh. Let me begin by asking you about your report and the finding that the bottom 50% have had their wealth chipped away in 2021 and 2022, and 10% of the richest in the country own over 80% of the country's wealth. Give us a sense of how income inequalities have impacted the poor. And do you feel that this gap between the rich and the poor has only increased in the year 2021 and 2022?
Thank you, Parikshit. Thank you for having me on the show. I must say that the data is clearly showing some staggering numbers. It is really a scandal. What we're seeing is a scandal in the country at the moment. You talked of the wealth controlled by the top 1%. Let me just give you a very simple statistics. 21 top billionaires in this country actually own more wealth than 70 crore of India's population, which is going to be more than 50%. And, I think what's also important is for us to recognize another, I think, a very critical data point. Let me first give you the global figure that in the last 10 years, the wealth created, the top 1% have actually cornered 50% of that wealth. And since the pandemic, they've actually cornered 2/3 of that wealth. So the newly created wealth, 2/3 of it post-pandemic has gone to the top 1%. And this number is not very different. In India, the top 1% have actually taken 40% of those resources, whereas the bottom 50% have just got 3%. So it's fairly clear that even if the wealth is being generated, it's lining the pockets of the super rich and it's getting accumulated at the top. And on the other hand, we have seen the heart-wrenching stories starting from the migrant workers. We saw what happened to the informal sector during the pandemic. So this is really, I would say, a scandal, a wake-up call. We need to smell our coffee and start acting now. This cannot be postponed. And then let me just say one more thing. I think the myth of trickle-down needs to be busted. It's clear, if you look at the data that I talked of, that over the last 10 years, the concentration of wealth has been at the top. So we need to completely change this and take very direct, effective redistributive measures.
Right. You've spoken about how reduction in corporate tax rate and exemptions and tax concessions in previous budgets has impacted the poor. You've asked for an increase in wealth tax on the rich and a progressive taxation structure in the budget. Why do you think this is the need of the hour, and why should policymakers hear this out ahead of Budget 2023?
So, Parikshit, let me just give you one data point again about the corporate concessions and tax incentives that's called were given last year. So during the year 20 to 21, the projected revenue foregone because of these tax concessions to the corporates was 1,03,000 crores. That's 1.4 years of NREGA expenditure. So just imagine we saw NREGA providing the primary sustenance to the majority of this country. And that could have easily been enhanced, topped up with these resources. So it's fairly clear that these tax incentives do not trickle down to the poor. So we are talking about not just one-time tax. We are looking at windfall taxes. We are looking at wealth taxes, inheritance tax, and progressive taxes. Let me just give you one more data point. I think that's going to be important. 64% of the GST last year came from the bottom 50%, whereas only 3% of the GST came from the top 10%. So this is where we are. I think at least this year, after the pandemic, we've seen the devastation caused. It is important the government listens to both its own political commitments that it's made in its political manifesto. It's also about, I would say, the commitment that our founding mothers and fathers made in our constitution of building an equal society. So I think it's critical that we take specific measures. And let me just also say that these specific measures are not just in the tax architecture. That's going to be one of the fundamental shifts. But I think we need very serious enhanced investments in public services like education and health. And we would also say that, you know, the third dimension that we keep asking for is to actually look at ensuring minimum wages for everyone. And during the pandemic, we saw how the informal sector was suffering. So in minimum wages for everyone, and also relook at minimum wages. Minimum wages must ensure a life of dignity for all.
Right. We did see the government taking several measures to support those at the bottom of the pyramid during the pandemic, during the 2 years of the pandemic. But from your report, it seems that over the last 1 year, especially when it comes to inflation, especially when it comes to taxation, the inequalities have widened in the country. Could you specifically, if you speak about inflation first, this has been a key priority for the RBI to get things right, to reduce the inflation, especially the retail inflation. Give us a sense of how rural India has been impacted more and how has been the impact on the poorest in the country.
Yeah, so as just I talked of the GST numbers, we work on the ground with communities, and we have seen how the rural inflation actually has made life extremely difficult for the common people. And it's fairly clear that while inflation does not hit the rich people, but it's the poorest of the poor who suffer because of inflation. And we have seen with the Ukraine crisis, we are at this moment confronting multiple crises. So it's the food crisis, we have the fuel crisis, we have the inflation crisis, and we have the unemployment crisis. So all these put together, it's the majority of this country at the moment is facing hardships. And while this is happening, you're looking at a very small bunch of people. And as our report says, that this is really becoming a country only for the rich, are thriving. So that contradiction is something that needs to be addressed directly.
Right. Speaking about inequalities when it comes to women, when it comes to caste-based inequalities, has this inequality, has this gap increased, or has it been bridged to some extent?
So, you know, I'm glad you're asking this, that every year we look at inequality, and we are fairly clear that in India and probably across the world, the face of inequality is not just economic inequality. We'll need to factor in social inequalities of caste, of gender, of ethnicity, of religion, of geographies in this country. So let me again just give you one data point. And that's about the number of women billionaires in the top 100. No price is progressing. I'm sure people would imagine, but it's extremely low. There are only 7 women in the top 100 billionaires. And of these, 2 are essentially in the top 100 because of the family wealth. Let me also say that for every rupee earned by men in the last 1 year, women have earned only 63 paisa. So when you start looking at the gender dimension, then the gap becomes even more stark. And this we've seen in all social development indicators, and that's also very, very evident in terms of the economic disparity that we are seeing. So if you're looking at women and their wealth, it's going to be, we do not have that number this year, but we did that 2 years ago, and their access to wealth is way below what men have. And then you have the added issues of patriarchy. For instance, women don't end up even doing getting wages for the work they do, and there's tremendous amount of unpaid care work they have to do.
Right. I'd like to ask you about some of the measures that the budget can take and the government can take. You have outlined measures needed for the health sector, needed for education, in terms of increasing the percentage of the GDP when it comes to allocation for health and education. What can be done to this extent? And do you think some of the recommendations you have made, Amitabh, can they be addressed considering this is the last full budget ahead of the election?
So, Parikshit, I would say it makes a lot of political sense. These are issues which touch the common people. These are the issues that touch the majority of this country. As in, if the government decides to invest in a robust public health system or a robust public education system, I'm sure any government is going to get dividends. I do think that inequality is a massive question, and people are looking at this growing inequality. As in, just look at even an IMF is talking about the levels of inequality being unsustainable. So government has to act. But if you just look at health, because let's talk about health, because we've just gone through a pandemic. The out-of-pocket expenditure in this country is almost 60% in terms of the medical bills, and the global average is just 18%. I think this number is alarming, and any government must ensure a serious relook at why is this happening. Let me give you just another number. Our investment in public health has hovered around 1.25%, whereas our own governments, including this government, has made a commitment that the investment in health should be 2 to 3% of the GDP. And if you really look at the global averages, the investments is 8 to 9 to 10% even for our peer countries. Even a country like Sri Lanka does 1.6% of investment in health. So there are serious systemic structural problems that have already been identified. And I think the government needs to now demonstrate its will, particularly moving into this final year, to address these questions which affect the majority of the country and which are not really the issues of the top 1%.
Right. Amitabh, thank you very much for joining us. Certainly some disturbing reports there when it comes to your report. Thank you very much for outlining all those inequality challenges for us when it comes to the poor, when it comes to women and caste-based inequalities as well, and also recommendations for the Union Budget 2023. We're going to take a short break, but don't go anywhere. We will be joined by Sohinder Singh Gill, CEO of Hero Electric, to discuss how the FAME scheme that was started in order to give a boost to the EV ecosystem in the country, how that is under review, what needs to be done next, and how the fact that the FAME subsidies have been stopped for some players is impacting the EV sector. Don't go anywhere. That discussion is coming up.